First speaker was going to be Rick Baum. He was originally going to be chairing the panel. Unfortunately, some family illnesses came up, and he had to cancel at the last minute. And some of you have seen he produced his remarks. A few copies were typed up, and he was supposed to be the introductory speaker. And I'm actually going to read off his introductory remarks, and then have some introductory remarks of my own. And then we're going to get to Margaret here, who has been involved has written for an organization of part-timers. We'll be talking particularly about getting into some monetary nuts and bolts about how it is that part-timers get discriminated against in the system. And George, you'll need to introduce yourself because I
need no introduction.
That's right. And Carol Lang is going to be speaking, who has a lot of experience as an activist in the New York teachers unions. We're talking about some conclusions and experiences that she has, and maybe reading the part of Rick Baum's remarks about his experiences right here at CCSF. And then we'll sort of get back around, and then I think I'll be leading off with talking about kind of what to do about the situation. Pretty much, and the rest of us will all chime in. And then hopefully we'll have a nice discussion with everyone having the opportunity to put forward their point of view. So that's the basic plan here. So anyway, firstly, Rick Baum's remarks. He teaches government at CCSF, or at least he tries to. Being a part-timer, I just recently heard from him, they may be trying to cancel his classes as we speak. Sort of typical of the situation of part-timers, and he's worried about losing his health coverage, as well as a family medical situation. So that's kind of, in a certain sense, what's going on with Rick is what goes on with a lot of us part-timers. Anyway, so what Rick has to say to introduce all this is, to understand what happens to part-time faculty, one needs to examine what happens to workers under capitalism. Capitalists, business owners, in their pursuit of profits and to foster the accumulation of capital, seek to pay their workers as little as possible and work them as hard as possible. The less one is paid and the more they produce in a given time, the higher the profits, assuming the goods and services are sold. This model is more and more being applied to those of us who work in the field of education. Educators do not necessarily produce what Marxists would call surplus value. They don't directly make a profit in the public sector. They can in the private sector. You know, especially with the, you've got more and more for-profit colleges going on, the teachers in which are almost like, workers in an auto factory in a certain sense. But in any case, however, they play a vital role in reproducing the whole American and world social system, or enabling, to a certain sense, enabling those, the capitalists who are trying to make money in the future. Because they need a trained workforce. So educators train the next generation of workers so they can be effectively exploited, as well, of course, as training the future managers and supervisors of the system. And for that matter, in business schools. And if you look around, somehow there seems to be more and more business schools and less of other stuff. And then we have STEM, but let's not get into that. So as a result, you even have future owners, entrepreneurs, businessmen. They get their training in college. Schools, especially public one, are, in the last analysis, using public money to cover the cost of training so that businesses don't have to do the training themselves. Okay. Now, where do adjuncts fit in? In the past, an adjunct, a lecturer at a college, was somebody who had an outside job and expertise could be brought into the classroom so students could learn from those in the trenches. That was the way it was 50 years ago. Those with practical experience in the particular field, who did the work just as a kind of a side gig. Not in the gig economy nowadays, but, just pick up a few spare pennies, okay? However, more and more in the last period, adjuncts are replacing full-time instructors. The expansion of adjuncts means they are cheap and flexible workforce, which more and more depending on their teaching job to provide for their livelihood. Now, this cheap labor force has numerous benefits for the employer, i.e. the colleges. One, they're only hired when needed. Second, they often consist of people, like myself, I suppose, who are passionate about being teachers, many of whom can be taken advantage of because they are hoping to secure that ideal, full-time, well-paid, tenure-track position. Well, me not so much, but that's a personal story. Number 3, to have a chance of getting that desired full-time tenured job, many are willing to do extra unpaid work. And 4, so therefore, they tend to be heavily compliant workers, fearing if they make any waves, they will not be considered for that full-time job and even lose their current job to someone else or found just to be not needed. And finally, they're cheap labor. They get paid less, and some of the details about that Margaret's going to go through. Means more money, despite ongoing austerity. And so you have an increasing number in the colleges of overpaid administrators. At Peralta, I went to a Board of Trustees meeting a month ago, and the Peralta system is going through a huge budget crisis. So the Board of Trustees meeting started out with them rattling off the name of 11 administrators, each being paid over $100,000 a year, who are being appointed this month in the middle of a huge budget crisis. 11. And enabled a declining number of tenured, and by the way, tenure is under threat, tenured, threatened full-timers to maintain a significantly higher standard of living. Tenured instructors, even in the community colleges, tend to make good money, and even more so, of course, in the four-year schools. Say at UC Berkeley, being a full-time professor at UC Berkeley is one of the last sinecures available on Earth. But anyway, and in general, many educational institutions are more and more adopting a corporate model. If you read their stuff, they talk about, essentially adopting the corporate model with all the power at the top. So you have this huge emphasis on productivity with all sorts of stuff with things like learning outcomes and paperwork to be done to measure the productivity, which means larger and larger classes, processing more students through the institution quickly. And this, by the way, is parallel to things going on in the general economy. In the last 30 or 40 years, as unions have been under attack, many unions have conceded to what are called two-tier situations, where someone who's only been working there for like 5 years or 10 years gets significantly less money than an old veteran. Well, this is definitely the model, although the origins are different. And secondly, there's a lot of talk, and I believe there's been a lot of talk at different panels in the Labor Fest about the gig economy. Well, adjuncts are members of the gig economy who often get no health coverage whatsoever, and often, especially if there's no union at all, have no job security whatsoever. Okay. So that's Rick's remarks. And I think Rick gave a pretty good, is giving a pretty good summary of the overall situation of part-timers. I want to talk about the background, okay, the overall background, the overall picture, what lies behind the increasing exploitation of part-time faculty and of a lot of other people, faculty of the whole American non-elite, the working class. The overall picture, biggest picture, in the aftermath of education, in the aftermath of World War II, the United States of America was the great winner of World War II and was on top of the world economically, militarily, culturally, in every possible way. This made possible in the post-World War II a huge expansion of public education at all levels, including at the college level. Huge growth of colleges. The percentage of the American population being students being higher than any place else in the world, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. I don't think that's true anymore. I don't know the statistics. And in fact, back then, this may be hard for you to believe these days, but back in the 50s and 60s, a lot of colleges were free, especially in the public sector. Okay? Community colleges were almost invariably free. State colleges were usually free. UC Berkeley, I believe, had no tuition until the 1960s. UC Berkeley. A little different from nowadays, right? And for that matter, the private sector, places like Harvard and MIT, had vastly lower tuitions than they did now. I can say that's from personal experience. In the year 1971, I was admitted to Columbia University. That fall, my tuition was about $2,500, and I paid for it with a summer job. I don't think that would be exactly possible today, to say the least, right? Okay. And then in the 60s, a bunch of things happened. One of the things that happened was the explosion of radicalization, which exploded into, to some degree, into the labor movement, particularly into the public sector. Before the 1960s, the private sector was considerably unionized, and the public sector was almost non-unionized. Nowadays, the private sector is far weaker, but the public sector, starting in the 60s and part of the inflation sector, the public sector got unionized, which was previously mostly non-union, starting in the colleges and everywhere else in the public sector, starting with the blue-collar workforce. This crept up the social ladder through the white-collar staff, and finally up to the faculty, a process still going on. Even at this point, you have unionization. One of the few areas in which you have unionization drives going on is in various colleges. Okay, but another thing happened in the 60s and the 70s. The United States won World War II, but there's another war called Vietnam, which the United States lost, with dramatic effects on America. Essentially, I could do a whole lecture, but I'll just say briefly that it's been downhill for America ever since the United States lost the Vietnam War, although there's been a lot of ups and downs in the process. So free tuition is long gone. Expenditures on public education are at a downward spiral. In the last analysis, it's always about the money in considering educational issues. There's less and less money for education these days and more for the police and military. In a deindustrialized America, whose control over the rest of the world has been diminishing since 9/11 and losing 2 more wars, one in Iraq and one in Afghanistan. And we're just coming out of the Great Recession of 2008. Now, the United States managed to avoid stumbling into another Great Depression, although it seemed touch and go for a while, both worldwide and in America. But that's still an ominous possibility, especially with that genius Donald Trump running the economy. Okay? The American empire, which looked like it was completely dominating the world. We had a single superpower world. End of history, someone called it. In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed and America won the Cold War, the American empire is in big trouble. So the powers that be in this country are steadily becoming less and less interested in educating the population, and more in keeping them in line and preventing the lower classes from causing trouble. That's why it is that here in California, the bluest of blue states, the prison system is better funded than education. And police brutality and outright murder of non-whites is every bit as common here as in ultra-red states like Texas. So that is the overall background that people need to understand when thinking about the situation of part-time instructors and what to do about it. We're in big trouble, but so are the students, so are their parents, and blue and white collar workers in the colleges as well. Right now we have this Janus case. I think there's probably some panels about this other times at Labor Fest. If there haven't been, there should have been. Which is the latest attack in a decades-long war waged against organized labor in general, during which the percentage of unionized workers, despite the rise in the public sector unionism, has fallen to just over 10%, about half of what it was in the 1980s. From the Great Recession on, the Obama administration mounted a massive assault on public education nationally under the guise of so-called school reform that featured brass-knuckle attacks on teacher unions, which Trump, of course, has continued and accelerated with now the help of the Supreme Court. That is the overall context we need to understand as we consider what to do about the exploitation of part-timers.
Yeah, John creates a sketch of a framework. My name is Geoge Wright, and retired university professor, taught at Cal State University for 34 years, and taught political science, international relations. And I taught at Skyline College. I taught history there for 8 years as a full-time professor and retired in 2013. And in fact, my talk is going to be entitled Me and Public Education, because what I'd like to do is to walk through my experiences historically within the body or belly of public education and kind of trace my observations at the time of a system that was open, free, and had enormous access and certainly allowed social mobility. I, coming out of a working class African-American background, was able to teach at a university for as long as I did, as well as get a PhD, et cetera, et cetera. And that was almost given when I came out of the 1950s and 1960s. The context that John sketched out could be elaborated, and I'm not going to do that in my talk, although next Sunday we're having part of Labor Fest, a all-day conference over at Finland Hall in Berkeley, talking about public education and privatization and other issues related to that. And I'm going to be on a panel, and I'd like to talk about the politics around, I will talk about the politics of privatization and corporatization at that panel, although maybe some questions could come up after our talk. I'll try to do this as quickly as I can. I'm known to talk for hours about these kinds of things. The first thing I want to do, well, first of all, I lived in public education for 54 years, starting in high school. I went to Catholic schools prior to the 10th grade. And my experience has been an amazing experience. I wouldn't be who I am today if it wasn't for public education. First point I want to make, I went to a public high school in Los Angeles in the late 50s, early 60s, Los Angeles Washington High School. It wasn't technically an inner city school at the time, but to give you some idea, when I went there as a 10th grader in 1959, a school with about 3,300 students had about 300 African-American students. 6 years later, when my two sisters graduated from Washington, the numbers were 180 degrees opposite. There were 3,000 black students and about 300 white students at the school at the time. Luckily, the kind of education I got from teachers that inspired me and experiences that I had, I was a sports editor and I was a damn good distance runner, which led me to get several scholarships to college to run track and field, run distance, which opened up a lot of doors for me. I could go into great detail there, but we're going to move to the next point. The next point I want to make is I also look at myself as a child of the California Master Plan for Higher Education. Anybody here not know what that is? I do. Okay. In 1960, the real Governor Brown, Pat Brown, signed a bill called the California Master Plan for Higher Education. And what it basically did was to coordinate the JCs, or the junior colleges, as to what they were called at the time. They're now community colleges. These state colleges, as well as the universities, more or less in an integrated system. And the goal within that system was to have that system to be open and have full access, and also it was to be free. To give you some idea, John mentions that schooling was free at the time. When I went to Los Angeles Harbor Junior College in 1962, it wasn't tuition, it was a fee. It was $7.50. Today it would probably be about $80, using inflation over that period. When I transferred to Chico State, the fee was $47.50. Textbooks were about $1.45 to about $2.45. To give you some idea, when I graduated after 2 years working on a master's degree and a teaching credential, I had a state guaranteed loan at 2%. That was $2,000, okay? When I paid that off with my first job within 2 years, to give you some idea of how different it was. Also, what we do want to stress very strongly, though, that system was also about channeling students into different niches within the political economy as well, which we could talk about later. I guess that's all I want to say there, although we could say an awful lot more about that. John mentions this, and I do want to add this, that this was happening, as John referred, to what was called the Golden Age, where the U.S. political economy was at its most dynamic. Growth was going on at least 4, 5, 6% annually. Anybody could get a job. When I was in high school in Los Angeles, if you didn't go on to College. And luckily, if you didn't go into the military, you could walk down the street to Goodyear Rubber, to Firestone Rubber, which is up on Firestone Boulevard, or go over to Southgate, where General Motors had a plant, and you could get a living wage job within a day, okay? And buy a house and buy a TV and a refrigerator and all those kinds of things. So it was a different world. It was also the height of U.S. imperialism, as John refers to Vietnam as a turning point. I think there's several other things that made the turning point occur, but the U.S. basically was the unquestioned hegemonic power of the world system. Now, related to my experiences within that context, one, a BA in history, an MA, and a teaching credential. When I graduated with a master's degree, I taught high school for 2 years at Chico High School. I was first African-American to teach there. And then I was asked to teach at Chico State in 1969, part-time, teaching political science. It was specifically a black politics class, which I taught. And the following year, things were pieced together to where I had a full-time job in the department, plus a tenure-track position. We have to remember this was a moment when you didn't have to have a PhD to get tenure at a state college. And in fact, one of the three greatest teachers I ever had, a man named William Hutchinson, we called him Old Hutch, he taught history at Chico State. He didn't have a BA, nor did he have a PhD. He only had a master's degree from Chico State in history. He's still, one of the two greatest teachers I've ever had, and he was probably the most published teacher that I've ever had in any experience except working on my PhD, to give you an idea of how things were different at the time. Also, it was a period when you could teach. You didn't have to worry about student learning outcomes and all the BS that we'll talk about in a moment. Also at the time, related to teaching, we didn't look at teaching as a career necessarily. Most of us looked at teaching as an art form, where we could use our own perspective, our own alternative view of the world, based within the context of the curriculum. And we could use our experience and our, believe it or not, our instincts to figure out how we should teach these courses. This was based on my philosophy that students don't learn at the same time. They learn at different rates, and they learn in different ways. And I always looked at myself as a teacher as simply planting seeds and hope they germinated within the next 20 to 25 years. I do have a lot of experiences to indicate that. In fact, just this weekend, I got an email from a guy named Tim Driver, who was a student of mine in 1971. And he wrote me in this email, he said, "We're up in Chico and we got a football reunion. And I just want you to remember I was the hippie football player." And I said, "Damn," I wrote him back and I said, "Of course I remember you." And one day I saw him in the gym with a book by Marx in his back pocket. I knew he was cool. By the way, he thanked me for what I gave him. This is now, 46 years ago? So, it was a different time. Now, I taught for 34 years at Chico State. And while I was there, I saw steps occurring gradually leading towards the corporatization and the privatization of the university. There's a whole list of them. I could go into I could add to this list. But one of the early things, quickly by the mid-70s, you had to have a PhD to teach. Decisions were made related to the ratio of full-time tenure track and part-time teachers, which is a problem obviously being faced that John and Rick's comments refer to. One of the more sinister things that happened was back in the early 80s, they introduced merit pay, meaning that the chair of the department had the right to give additional monies to individual faculty because of their outstanding teaching. Well, obviously, that's not the way it went, because I was the best teacher in the department, I believed anyway. And the money went to his buddies and not to the real teachers who were in the trenches, if you know what I mean. Now, obviously, and how we determined that, by the way, was FTE. Without a doubt, I brought in the most FTE of anyone in my department, and I subsidized some of my enemies in the department who didn't have as much FTE as I had. Guess who got all of the merit pay? It was the...
FTE is full-time equivalent students. However many students you get tends to
Now,
determines how much money the university, the college gets.
Now, the implication of that is the morale of the faculty also was poisoned dramatically by that, and divisions were made, and it wasn't a pretty picture, and it continued for a long time. Another thing that happened was the advent of televised courses, outreach courses. I taught one of them, and I never would teach it again because I like to see the eyes of my students, okay? I didn't know who was out there. I could just hear voices. But now online courses, televised courses using telecommunications tends to be the vogue now within departments. And it's not teaching in my mind. It's just rote memorization. Let's see, what else do we see? And then what I began to see was the introduction in the 90s of assessments, and then gradually this idea of student learning outcomes. Luckily for me, I retired right at that moment, okay? And so I didn't have to deal with student learning outcomes. Moved down to San Francisco for some personal reasons. And then luckily, within the year, I serendipitously fell into a part-time job at Skyline College teaching history. And then the second year, I was put in a full-time position there. This was back in, 2005, I guess it was, teaching history, which was my undergraduate degree anyway. I was really excited about being able to teach at the community college level. A bunch of reasons. One, when I got there, it was like Chico in the early 70s. You could teach, and you didn't have to worry about all the other BS, if you know what I mean. And it was great. I could go in the classroom and do what I wanted to do within the curriculum. Secondly, there was a kind of a solidarity among the faculty within the department. There were no divisions. We compared notes. We talked about students, experimented with ideas that other people gave input to. And it was a very rich experience, very similar to the experience I had in the 1970s at Chico. Another reason why I wanted to teach at the community college, I had gone to the community colleges, and there were three teachers that inspired me very strongly. Mr. Garvin, took a political science class from him, and I got a D in it, okay? And then later, when I got a PhD in politics, I called him up and said, Professor Garvin, you may not remember me, but I took a class from you. Even though I got a D, you really inspired me. He said, I knew that you were going to make it somehow, is what he told me, okay? Those are the kind of things that make it very, very exciting. What was the other? Also, the reason I wanted to teach at the community college, I got another paycheck because my pension wasn't as big as I wanted it to be, okay, or what it should have been. How much time?
Let's say about another 5 minutes.
Okay, well, great. So again, when I got there in 2004-05, it was a very, very rich experience. But gradually over the next couple of years, you could begin to see, as an old running term, the bear climbing on your back, okay? Meaning the corporatization and the privatization ideas were seeping into even the junior college level. Now I'm going to kind of shift it a little bit. All of you guys know the story of what went on or what maybe still is going on at San Francisco City College. Obviously, the accreditation board was putting penalties on City College, and the framework was obvious, and that's corporatization, privatization, more faculty to undermine the union, to eliminate the powerful faculty government role in governance of the City College, and a number of other objectives that the accreditation board had. Well, Skyline was going to be accredited in 2013, 2014. So the administration and the deans were going bonkers over what was happening at San Francisco City College, and they wanted to not have that kind of experience. And so they were forcing the faculty to write reports that normally take a year or maybe even 2 years to finish over the weekend. And all kinds of bureaucratic stuff, which obviously was taking us away from the classroom dramatically. And then all of a sudden, I realized that this student learning outcome stuff was really important to these people. And I had luckily, the way I am, I just kind of ignored it for a long time. And then all of a sudden, one day I woke up that I found that I was in complicity morally, politically, and pedagogically with something that I despised, okay? And I was really troubled by this in the sense that, you know, I played within the system, but I played by my rules. I was very pleased. I was happy that I was able to do that. And all of a sudden, I realized that, you know, when I'm lying in bed when I'm 90 years old and I reflect on my teaching career, I would have to say to myself, you know, you gave in or sold out the last couple of years you were teaching. So I was really wrestling with that dilemma. Now, what happened in March of 2013, we're in a division meeting, and there was a discussion about the accreditation issue and also about student learning outcomes. And ironically, a person who was in the union on the executive board of the local was explaining what student learning outcomes, where I felt that an executive from the board should be arguing against student learning outcomes. And because I'll explain why in a minute. And so anyway, one of my close colleagues in the audience raised her hand in the division meeting and said, what does student learning outcomes mean? And the person, the executive board person said, I don't know. And I blurted out, standardization of public education. And all of a sudden, the dean ran from the front of the classroom and got about 2 inches from my face and said, and we were like friends for 8 years. And all of a sudden, 6 inches in front of my face, she said to me like I was a 3-year-old kid, will you come with me? Will you come with me, okay? And I just sat there looking at her, and I said, I'm not going anywhere with you. And she kept repeating this, and all of a sudden and I kept saying, I'm not going anywhere with you. And she retreated, and I sat there, and about 5 minutes later, I said, damn, I don't belong here. So I went over to San Francisco State. I was kind of the mascot of the women's track and field team over there, and I had a workout, and it was one of the great afternoons in a long time. And I came back to school on Monday, and there was everybody in they were all upset. Half the faculty said, George provoked all of this, and the other half rallied around me. But I realized that they were in their 40s and 50s, they had kids, they had mortgages, and I was, in my late 60s. And I could retire, they can't. So I realized very quickly that I was on my own. The union didn't really want to intervene for whatever reasons. I think I have some ideas. But to finish this up real quickly, about 3 weeks later, the dean emailed me. And I thought what she was going to say was, George, I'm really sorry. I've been under a lot of pressure on this. The accreditation's happening. And let's make amends here, whatever. She didn't say that. She said, would you come to my office and you can bring a union official and I want you to come to discuss your behavior at the division meeting. There's one word that black people and people in general don't like, and that's your behavior, okay? And so I sat there at my computer for about 10 minutes, and I started thinking about how much money I had. and then about 5 minutes later, give me a second. I made a quick decision that you're going to retire, man. It's time to go. This is a battle you can't win from inside, and you're not going to have a good time teaching, and so it's time to bail out. And I went online to find out, how do you write a retirement letter? And I found out I had to send it to the dean initially, But I bailed out. But what was so neat was, in spite of all that, the faculty senate voted me the person, I don't know what the name is, but during the graduation, I was to be the leader of the graduation ceremony. And I waved at the dean and said, hello. Okay, that's my story. I hope there's some lessons there.
I may. That's better? Okay, so the community college system educates 2 million students in 72 districts, 112 colleges. It's the largest system in the world. There are around 40,000 part-time faculty working in the system now, down from a statewide high of 45,000, and 19,000 full-time faculty. About 59% of the academic staff is part-time, restricted by law, and this is the only case I know of where actual state statutes require a load limit of only 67% of, it was 60%, now it's 67% of a full-time load. The earnings on average of all the part-time faculty in this system are about 37% of the full-time faculty. That's what all 40,000 earn, about a third of what a full-time faculty earns. That does not account for the increased value of benefits, sabbatical, job security, and other parts of the employment picture. As the others have said, the tuition was free for many years. It was $11 in 2005, I believe, and is now around $36 a credit.
And it got up to 46.
I think it's popped back down. Because of the BOG waivers, the Board of Governors waivers, it's still free for a significant number of students. In Peralta, I think quite a lot.
Oh, yeah.
The California Community College system has been credited with a significant role in the robust, booming California economy, and since 1976 has educated, I heard this somewhere, I don't exactly remember where, that 1/10 of the working population has at one time or another gone through the California Community College system. Politically, it's administered by largely by local control, unlike the UC system and the Cal State system. And each contract is negotiated locally in those 72 districts. And the UC system, of course, has a statewide lecturers union. We have a patchwork of 4 unions who represent the part-time faculty very badly, I might add, since our pay is so low. CTNEA represents 30 districts, but they're quite small. About 38 or 39% of the faculty. CFT, 24 districts. Independence, 11 districts. CWA, UPD, 3 districts. This is the union representation of the part-time faculty. And in 35 years, most of these districts came into being between 67 and 76. During that period, the parity or relationship between full-time and part-time faculty has not changed for about half of the districts. That means they earned 20% or 30% of what a full-time faculty earned in 1967, and they still, with union representation, earn approximately that same amount 35 years later after paying dues for 35 years. So there's 2 points that I'm going to cover. One is parity. I'm going to explain what that means to you. And the other is I'm going to look at the dues structure. The dues come into the local, and then they're redistributed to the state and national level of the unions, either AFT or NEA. So parity is this relationship between full-time and part-time. Most districts have maintained that a full-time faculty will spend 80% of their time approximately doing just teaching. And so if a full-timer was paid, a part-timer was paid equally, they would be paid 80% of a full-time salary. If a full-timer made $100,000 and had to do some administrative work or some committee work or something like that, the equivalent salary for the just teaching part would be $80,000. But these structural inequities of the first inaugural negotiated contract for most districts 30 or 40 years ago have continued to control the parity relationship for 30 years. Only about 8 or 10 districts have managed to move the part-timers closer to full-timers in pay. The dues during this time, and this is a 30-year period, part-timers have contributed approximately $1 million per year to the unions. And as I will show later, all of this money, and the word is ALL, all of this money has gone upstairs to CFT, the state level, and AFT, the national level. Almost nothing has stayed from part-timers in the local in order to fund negotiations. So even though the average statewide parity increase has been 5%, that's over a 25-year period, that's mostly a few districts. They are Marin, Foothill DeAnza, City College of San Francisco. Those three have popped up around 15%. The rest of them have been flatlined for 30 years. So I ask you, what kind of a union is going to represent two tiers of the employees, right? One of which is making $20,000 and one of which is making $100,000. What kind of a union is that? Go ahead and answer. Give it a name.
It's a lousy union.
It's a crime scene. I wanted to bring yellow tape, and I wanted to make it visual, that this is actually a crime scene. We've been playing for a level of representation that is missing. So the lowest paid in the state make $20 to full-timers $100 for the exact same work. The highest paid in the state earns $60 to a full-timer's $100. Now, in the same period, women have achieved 77% wage parity, people of color around 71%, African Americans 73%, Hispanics 69%, Department of Labor statistics. So part-time faculty are significantly below, at 20%, are significantly below any other group for whom discrimination has been claimed and won in the courts. In 2000, the California legislation appropriated $60 million to close the parity gap. It became aware of this issue, and it appropriated a significant amount of money for districts to close that gap a little bit. It was around, in 2005, it was around 32, 34%. And what happened is in all 72 districts, I could find only these 8 with significant parity repair. That's Cabrillo, West Valley Mission, Chabot, San Mateo, Foothill, DeAnza, CCSF, Ventura, Cerritos, Sonoma, and El Camino. The rest of these districts, this is the other 72, made almost no progress, even with that $60 million a year added to the categorical funding of the community college system in order to close that gap. Many people believe that that money was just dropped into the general fund, or that money was used exclusively for full-time faculty overloads, or was used perhaps as a one-off payment, so it didn't go on the pay schedule. It was just kind of a bonus during the year of parity money. That was about 4 years. These are the districts that made progress, and here they were before the parity money. So these are the only ones that kind of popped up to around 55, 60%. Despite us living in an education-positive civilization, The unions, the legislature, and the court system have together failed to raise part-time faculty pay even to 50% of full-time pay over 30 years despite union representation. This is, in my view, a crime scene. The handout about parity, it's right here. If you want to read this, this is a published account in much greater detail. Was published in 2015 by the California Part-Time Faculty Association, a non-affiliated, non-union advocacy group. It's called the Parity Fairy Tale. Second thing I want to quickly talk about is dues. How many people here are dues-paying members of a union? Okay, what's your union AFT? And how much do you pay per, what's the percentage dues? Okay, what's your percentage? 1.5. What's your percentage? Oh, somebody had their hand up here. Can't remember. Okay. Do you know how much goes to AFT national out of your dues? No. Okay. So the takeaway here is that PFT have been paying dues into a system. This is 4 union systems, NEA, AFT, the independents, and CWA. About 10 million a year for the total of maybe 2.8 billion in 30 years. This should be 30, not 3. In order to be kept in all but a handful of districts in extreme poverty. This is the picture of criminally negligent representation in my view. Somewhere between 95 and 99% of that money goes upstairs to the state and national level, where the advocacy for part-time faculty is near zero. In fact, some of the dues money that part-time faculty pay into their national and state level of their union is used to lobby against positions that would be beneficial to part-time faculty. So not only is their money not used to raise up their pay to equitably to the full-time faculty, their money is used against their interest in a number of cases.
Can I ask, just at 95 to 99% for you, that sounds a little high to me. Do you have some, examples of actual monetary examples to back that up?
Sample 1, 50,000. Okay, at 1.5, that's 650 in dues taken out, right? 240 goes to national, 526 to the state level. Oops, the local gets nothing. In fact, the local is short $160. Example 2, 30,000. 450 taken out, half per caps due to the state level, 240 to the national, 263 to the state. The local's short $53. Example number 3, 20,000, 300 dues taken out, half per caps to the state, full per caps still due at the national level. Oops, still not enough. Local is short.
Then how do the locals pay their bills if they pay?
Full-time dues. If a full-timer is going to pay, they're going to take out, instead of 600, they're going to take 1,500 out, but they're going to send this same amount upstairs. They take 1,500 out, but they get to hold 800 of the full-time dues locally. Okay? So when it took me 30 years. I was the vice president of a union in Vermont. I was the lead negotiator for the statewide part-time faculty contract, and I kept asking about dues. They said, "Oh no, we don't separate it. We don't. No, it's we don't really know how much the per caps are. We don't really know how much." It took me literally 30. This story took me 30 years to figure out. This is not easy to figure out because there are many obstacles. So what I am assuming is happening is either the locals are starved of part-time faculty-generated dues, or they are lying, and I suspect it's the second. What they do is they send upstairs an amount, and They estimate how many people are in the half caps and the quarter caps and the eighth caps, and they basically underestimate the earnings of their part-time faculty so they don't have to pay all their money up to the state. I'm assuming.
Good assumption, I suspect.
Well, I don't know. So that's the dues situation. Yes?
Is there any kind of, is this public information, transparent, like something that someone could look up and trace potentially?
Yes. Yes, there's constitutions. That's how I found it, is I looked at the constitutions. I said, wow, the state takes 500 and the national takes 180, but the part-timer is only assessed 1.5%.
Right.
I just did the math.
I mean, this obviously creates, some kind of resentment of the local chapters because they're going to favor the full-time workers because they don't have to make up the dues. That structure right there already seems kind of.
Well, and also the nationals become vampires then. They just have their syringe like pulling blood really from the part-time faculty. So that up at the AFT level, you say, wow, okay, so we're sending about somewhere around 1/10 of their budget is coming around the nation from part-timers with zero recognition, zero help. So here's the other wrinkle, is that most part-time faculty work at multiple districts. And here's the kicker, is you're not only paying once, but if you make up to the income threshold, you could be paying 2, 3, and 4 per caps upstairs. So to AFT, if a full-time job is split in 2, it gets 2 full per caps. And the state gets 2 full per caps, right? So you have quadrupled the money going upstairs by dividing a job in half.
Per cap, what do you mean by that?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Per capita money is taken out of your check as a percentage, but it's sent to the national and the state level as a head tax. No name, just a per number of people, right? It's called a per capita, it's called an affiliation tax. If you affiliate with AFT, all the locals must pay this affiliation fee per individual.
Could you just repeat what you said, how this affects multiple district teaching positions?
That's correct. That's correct. If you work in 3 districts, that local, if you make $18,000 in each district, each local is going to send a per capita payment, the full per capita, to the AFT from each local. That means you're paying 3 dues.
How much would that be per?
$526 per year.
Which is not the same. In other words, what you're saying is like the lecturer pays a percentage, just like the full-timer, but over and above that, there's a head tax that has to be paid by the local?
No, it comes out of your dues.
So you have different percentages?
No, everybody pulls 1.5.
So if everyone pulls 1.5, how can the part-timers pay a larger amount than the full-timers?
Because the part-timers are paying that amount for each district that they work in.
Well, yeah, for multiple districts, but within the same district.
Same per cap,
But it,
526.
So is it?
I don't get the math, but anyway, go on.
You should actually know this,
Yeah. but-
okay?
All right.
You should know this. If you don't know this yet,
Now, what I'm not understanding is what you're saying is that, let's say a part-timer earns $20,000 and a full-timer earns $80,000. So if the part-timer pays 1.5% of that, that's 1.5% of 20,000, and the full-timer pays 1.5% of that, that's 80,000. Then the full-timer will be paying 4 times as much as the part-timer, right?
no, they're all being assessed the same dues, 1.5. That's what's being pulled from their check.
Yeah, but
what's going upstairs is a flat fee.
Well, yeah, that's what I said. What it sounds like it's saying is, okay, let's go on. We'll work out the math later.
So the thing of it is, this gentleman is a part-time faculty rep in his union, and he doesn't know that,
Not
okay?
a rep, just a member of the committee.
Oh,
But-
okay. So this is the basic problem, is this information about dues is very poorly understood even by union presidents, right? Even by part-time faculty reps, even by staff members, paid staff members, right? So this is not well understood, that part-time faculty are assessed 3 or possibly 4. I worked at 4 districts. That our money is all going upstairs, not just from one paycheck, but from all 4 paychecks, which means that the national and the state level of the union are eating an enormous amount of the part-timers' very small wage of about $18,000 or $20,000 per district.
Still don't get the math. If we're all paying 1.5%. All right, anyway, let's move on.
So this is a sad story. It did take me 30 years to sort of figure it out, asking questions and looking at documents. But I believe that there are some directions that we need to go in terms of remedies. One would be a legislative load limit raised to 80 or 85 and limits on full-time faculty overloads. The full-time faculty controlled unions are partly responsible for this load limit. We can only work 60% or 67%, in my view, because the full-time faculty have lobbied very strongly to have access to overloads. So you can go to Transparent California and you can see many full-time faculty in the community college system earn $200,000, $250,000 by working overloads. So they can work in some districts, not all, kind of an infinite number of classes they can teach, whatever they're willing to take on. There is no ceiling in most districts. And part-time faculty, on the other hand, are limited by state statute to 0.67% of a load, right? So one thing we could do is raise the load limit. That wouldn't have to be negotiated 72 times in 72 districts. That's a statutory fix that would help a lot of part-time faculty. We could have parity pay legislated. All you'd have to do is say a labor law that would say you have to pay people the same amount for the similar kind of work. Okay, it would become illegal with one simple statute for this kind of employment situation to be erased from history. All you'd have to do is say it is illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of their employment status. This is discriminatory.
But as you stated earlier, the union would probably fight against that legislation.
Well, post-Janus, it may be a different situation.
Yeah, not in a good way.
So you might have a statutory automatic or semi-automatic conversion to full-time with satisfactory evaluations. And so there's 3 or 4 things you can do legislatively, legally. There's class action lawsuits. If you brought lawsuits, all you'd have to have is a couple of lawsuits that would trigger then legislative change. Discrimination in the United States is in fact illegal. The protected categories of gender, race, ethnicity, and religion are not the only categories. You can bring, yes.
I was going to say, couldn't you also file a lawsuit, and I'm not sure if this case was one, farm workers suing UC Davis for using public funds to develop technology for large corporations like Monsanto putting farmers out of work. So I don't know if there's a lawsuit where you could say that.
I think it's a very rich territory. I think the court route is a very rich territory. And I'm not saying any of these is the full fix, but I believe that activists should focus on all of these routes of remedy.
Are you seeing more schools put binding arbitration clauses in employment?
Pardon?
Are you seeing more colleges put binding arbitration clauses in employment contracts?
No, I'm talking about state law. I'm talking about a court-ordered state law change. And so once a Supreme Court, as in the case of Janice, determines something to be constitutional or unconstitutional, then there's that cascade of state laws and local laws that have to change in obedience to federal court decisions.
Any idea what this would cost?
I don't know who the money would come from. The question is, who do you sue? Do you sue the community college system or do you sue the unions? Right? I don't know. I don't know. I think if it's coming from you could forfeit the monetary, you could waive the monetary judgment in favor of a kind of new page.
Yeah, actually, we're sort of moving into general discussion here, so maybe we should finish this presentation and move to the next one.
Okay, bargaining coordinated statewide strategy, a guild of part-time faculty bargainers. Most of them around the state are not in touch with one another. They're working in isolation. They have no idea what a good strategy would be. So I think it would be nice to have them talk to one another. Most people are very oriented towards their own district. They do not have a statewide perspective, and there's probably a lot of great ideas out there, but everybody's working in virtual isolation. We need to have a frank evaluation of statewide part-time faculty leadership. That's relatively weak. And of course, the nuclear option, the decertification campaign, that could be a threat or it could be a real thing. And that would be to decertify from the AFT and the NEA and to start a new part-time faculty statewide union, much like they have in the UC system. All the lecturers statewide are in the same union. So that's another possibility. That's my presentation.
So I had, before I go into what I wanted to talk about, I had two thoughts about some themes that, as I was listening to other people speak, I wanted to talk a little bit about the City University and when it began in New York. The higher education in New York is sort of almost part of the DNA of the city. The first higher education, the first city university, City College, started in 1847. And it was because the working class in New York City had demanded that their children be able to go to school. New York was always the commercial center of the United States, and people were actively participating in unions. There were newspapers of workers on the left, and the working class was pretty active during that period and really wanted their kids to go to school. So the first unit of the City University started in 1847, and now we have 24 units later. In the 1970s, when John was talking about how people were starting to go to school en masse in the 1960s, if you looked at the booklets at the City University for the courses that were given, and it was about education. It was about learning, it was about intellectual development, it was about discourse, all of that. I mean, the booklets at the City University were enormous. They had courses on history as literature, literature as history. I mean, it was really a fabulous place to develop your mental capacities, your ability to learn, your criticisms of the world. There was a big mass movement at the City University. If you look at the booklets now, do you want to become an automotive engineer? I work at a community college, and since the 1970s, things had really switched with, especially the community colleges. The four-year colleges are still about discourse, science, things like that. But the community colleges are about pushing people into vocations. And so just as an example, I had a student who was learning to be, I teach history, who was learning to be an automotive engineer, and he said, well, what do I need this for? I'm going to be a mechanic. I don't need to be able to learn history and learn how to think and do criticism. And I always get really very upset when I hear things like that. But the focus, and I have had students who really actually liked history and wanted to take more courses, but their financial aid wouldn't pay for it because they were going on a vocational track. And so anything that has to do with sort of intellectual development has become, has been basically thrown by the wayside. Everything is now about the bottom line. And really, in terms of the City University, it's really about how much financial aid we can get into our school. We don't care whether people are, and we care whether people are doing well or badly because we want you to come back and bring back your money. But now there's been, in the school that I work at, a particular deal that the college has made with some rich people, I'm not exactly sure who's offered to give millions of dollars to the school that I work as long as they get rid of remediation altogether. The students I'm going to go into in a bit, the students in my school are largely Black and Latin. English is their second language. Many students are from Africa. You get rid of the remediation and you get rid of the students, but they still have the financial aid coming in. So it's really the business model, par excellence. Okay, so basically, I had so many different things that I wanted to talk about, and I was initially thinking, at the City University in New York, the adjunct, although the cost of living is probably equal in New York, I would say, as in San Francisco, which is pretty high. I've been eating out and seeing what the prices are. We make half the salary, half the amount of money that people make in San Francisco, which is, and even some of the people who were on the panel were shocked to find out how much money we make, because it's possible, although I don't think in all the districts, to make $7,000 a course. If you don't have a class, let's say in the summer, you get unemployment insurance. In New York, the highest salary is $3,500 a course. If you want to get unemployment insurance, you have to fight for it. Sometimes you get it. A friend of mine told me that one of her colleagues fought for unemployment insurance and then was promptly fired from the job. So that it's a very, very precarious life. There was an article in The Guardian, I don't know if people saw this, but it was about adjuncting in general in the country. And it featured this woman who was an English teacher who just didn't get any jobs in the summer, so she had to supplement her income. So she became a prostitute over the summer in order to be able to, I don't know, have people seen this article? It was pretty shocking. And unfortunately, although I don't agree with Margaret, I don't think we should start a separate adjunct union, because we'd be if we ever do get a chance to go out on strike, we'd be crossing each other's picket lines. But it is true that the full-time faculty are the ones that are mostly prized and protected, where the adjuncts, and we have no job security. I have a friend who was working 16 years at the City College, and after 16 years, she got a letter saying, you're gone. Not, I'm sorry, we thank you for being here, you were a wonderful teacher. Nope, you don't have a job. So the two major demands that we're fighting for is 7K, of course, because that's parity, and for job security. Neither of which the union, although it pays lip service, really is fighting for it all. Okay, so I was going to start, this is not working. Help me here. I don't know this computer. It's not going on.
Oh, power is out. What happened?
I don't know, is it unplugged?
Oh, here you go.
Okay, so initially I was gonna, 2 fingers, okay. So initially I was gonna talk about the difficulties that the adjuncts are having making it in New York. I mean, people, the valedictorian at the school that I work at, who is an older man and therefore grown up, right? And he said in his talk to the students at Bronx Community, he wanted to particularly thank the adjuncts because they're living in their cars. And that's how people are forced to live. And there are people who are homeless, I mean, or essentially shacking up with other, I have a roommate for that reason. My roommate works essentially a full-time job, and can't afford an apartment in New York. So he basically lives with me. And there are just lots and lots of those anecdotes. People work 7 classes, they work online, they work distance learning, any way that they possibly can to basically make ends meet, which nobody is actually doing at all well. I also wanted to talk about our union. Our union is also part of the AFT. It's a different local. Essentially, what's happening with my local, with the president of my local, who considers herself a leftist of some variety, it's very difficult to even criticize her because there's a cult of personality. And therefore, everybody around her basically protects her, and you're saying something nasty about Barbara Bowen, how could you hurt her feelings? And therefore, everything political that we do turns into a personal thing and makes it very difficult to have any sort of discussion whatsoever. I mean, ultimately, the end of what I have to say is that all these people have to go because they're all in it for themselves and not really interested, as much as they cry crocodile tears, they're not really particularly interested in defending the workers at all. There was a long time when, everybody knows about Janice here, so I don't have to say what Janice is. Everybody knows Janice? Janice.
Explain it.
Janice was a worker in Chicago who essentially was the lackey of the Koch brothers. And he brought a case against AFSCME, which is the Clerical Workers Union. I mean, it has like millions of workers in this union across the country, that he didn't want to pay dues to the union. And he thought it was against his First Amendment rights, and therefore, where workers should be able to be defended by the union, he shouldn't have to pay dues. And agency fees. The way it worked in New York, which is, I'm sure, different in other places, which is one of the reasons why this is so difficult, and I'm hoping that you will all be able to help us come up with some sort of strategy that we can do this on a national level. The unions would go to Governor Cuomo, then the father of our now Governor Cuomo, and say, look, we'll control the workers if you just give us agency shop. And so that means that you can collect the dues without having to really deal with the messiness of having members being in the union. So that went along for quite a long time, up until this guy, Janice, ended up bringing a case to the Supreme Court. It was obvious with Trump's appointment that Janice was going to win and the union was going to be defeated. But it gave the union, my union, the opportunity of skirting the issues of fighting for its members. And so it spent months and months and months on discussing Janice, that we should all be discussing Janice, that we should all be signing up our co-workers, and that any other opportunity, to talk about what we were so upset about our poverty wages, always took the backseat to Janice. So just as an example of how crazy this got, we have an adjunct group inside the union, and I went to one of the union meetings, which I had to sort of stop going to after. The vice president, who, she's a very nice person, but in fact is a lackey of the president, she brought this person up to talk about Janice. And I said, we don't want to talk about Janice anymore. We want to talk about 7K. The other person that she had brought on board was the liaison, who was, also an adjunct. The first thing he said to us was, this is going to be very expensive for the city. And I said, we don't want to hear that. We want to hear what you're going to do to fight for us. So when they then brought on the woman who wanted to talk about Janice, I absolutely refused to let this woman talk. And every time she said something, I said, we don't want to hear about that. We want to talk about 7K. And this went on for quite a long time until my vice president said to me, if you were my student, I would kick you out of my class. I said, this is a union. This is not your classroom. And we have the right to discuss the issues that are confronting us. So the meeting ended. basically, and we ended up going nowhere. I'll introduce them. Anyways, so now that Janice has won, now they're obsessed, right, with signing everybody up. And another anecdote about this was that I said to somebody who was the secretary of the union, she's talking about Janice, and I said, you know, the workers probably won't sign up because the adjuncts don't feel protected by the union. And she said, really? I've never heard of that. I said, well, have you spoken to any of the workers recently? Because that's what they tell me all the time. So, but Janice is a big deal because the bourgeoisie wants to end unions, essentially, and that's what that's about. And so now there's a letter going around written by this guy, Mackinac, who also works for the Koch brothers, who's sending out a letter to the people who haven't signed up for the union saying, do you really want to do this? And so there's a full frontal attack on unions, and as upset as I am at my union, I always tell people that they should join it because they have to be in the union in order to be able to fight. But I think we have to all be concerned that the attitude of the bourgeoisie is basically to crush the unions. And we haven't seen, I don't think, anything yet.
We don't want to talk about Janice. We want to talk about 7K.
I do too. Okay. Okay, so the president of City College, here's a guy. This is the problem in New York, and this is the problem everywhere because, in fact, capitalism basically wants to reduce the wages of all workers and to make us, you know, essentially be McDonald's workers, you know, or similar to what they make in McDonald's. And so the president of City College in New York, who makes $400,000 a year, said, and this was very explicit, he said that the city university would not function if it wasn't for adjunct labor. So that not only are adjuncts being hired, we are now 57% of the city university. There was a time where adjuncts were, you know, if you needed a specialist, somebody would teach an adjunct class. But for the most part, they were full-timers. Now we're 57% of the city university, and it's gotten so bad that City College, with this $400,000 president, is now hiring the fourth-year students to teach the first-year students and calling them staff because basically it's illegal and paying them $20 an hour. And they have to pay to learn how to teach this class. So, what? Exactly. I mean, they've learned from the best, right? This is what the Coke industries do, and this is what Bezos does. This is the approach. Okay. Okay, so really what I would like to see, because New York is a little bit different than California. I mentioned a couple of the things. We don't get unemployment. We get much less pay. Not that the pay in California is particularly good, but there are different things going on within the structures of one union versus the structures of another, but the ideology is pretty much the same. And so what I'm hoping to achieve here is to, you know, get some idea about how we can figure this out, how we can create a union, not an adjunct union per se, but an organization that's going to begin to cohere another strategy so that we can fight nationally, not just city by city, because city by city is not going to do it. We're not going to win anything. We have to organize workers that are, John was talking about this yesterday, organizing a union that has janitors in it, secretaries. the bulk of the people who work in education, we should be, it's almost like the old Wobblies, the IWW, one big union. But we need to be doing that not just as in New York, but something that will span across, the entire country. In New York, we have a particular problem because here, California has the right to strike. The teachers have a right to strike. In New York, we have something called the Taylor Law, which prevents workers from striking, but the union is particularly happy and thrilled that this law exists. So every single year when it comes up in the delegate assembly to discuss the Taylor Law and whether we want to fight it, the delegate assembly always supports its maintenance. Now, you might wonder why. Well, I'm not sure that that's too difficult to understand. They don't want us to strike. We had not had a contract. That we just got a contract last year. It took 7 years to get that contract. Now, had we been able to strike, we would have had a contract a lot earlier. So what does my union do is they organize a strike vote. That's a strike authorization vote. 92% of my union supported that. And yet, it was only as a way of saying to Cuomo, Governor Cuomo, look what I got in my hand. We could do this if we want to. And yet, they settled for a contract where, for the most part, as I said, people are making either $3,200 or $3,500 a semester. The one concession that we thought we won was, for some people, a 3-year contract, that after every year, we would still be able to be on the payroll, because now, as I told you before, we have no job security. So at the end of the semester or at the end of a year, you can be laid off. So we got a 3-year contract, and it turned out, I didn't support the contract, but it went through. And it turns out that my president, and I want to say her name, Barbara Bowen, if anybody comes across that, Barbara Bowen. Barbara. Anyway, she continued to negotiate this 3-year contract after we had signed the contract, and that 3-year contract says that if a worker comes up for a 3-year contract and doesn't get it, they could be fired. And that's not anything that we had voted for. And yet, when we confronted her on it, she said, well, there are bumps on the road. And that was her response to me. There were bumps on the road. So therefore, it was okay to have a contract. So there were any number of people who came up for the 3-year contract and were fired after that. So as you can see, the union is pretty ineffectual. And, I don't think that my union is any more ineffectual than any other union. Basically, the nature of unionism forces them, not that they have any struggle with this, to really behave in the way that they do, because their job is sort of a dual job. Their job is to ostensibly negotiate for us, but keep us in check at the same time. And so, since they relate more to management than they do to the workers and find the workers a real big pain in the ass, essentially, they prevent dissidents from doing anything. So the only way that we've managed to get them to support this idea of 7K is by picketing the union. So we stood in front of the union hall, in front of the delegate assemblies. We crashed those meetings. We handed out flyers. And we said, we want 7K. And so, of course, they got on board. And the first thing they do is go up to Albany to talk to the politicians to try to convince them about why we're so important and we should be getting paid better. They have no intention of organizing any sort of militant action and will not allow anybody else to do so either. So anything that we do, as I told you, the vice president said I would kick you out if you were my student. This is pretty much the behavior of the union, and it's the behavior of all the unions, because they all operate in the sphere of capitalism. They would have to become militant revolutionaries to do anything other than what they do. So essentially right now, everybody this whole economy, as you said, it was an Uber, right? A gig economy. It's basically an economy that wants to reduce the wages of the workers as much as they possibly can. It's based on profit. It's based on driving workers as hard as they possibly can, and getting people to do long-distance learning, which basically means you can have as many people in your computer as you can possibly hold. And so we've gone up from somewhere around 25 as a cap to somewhere in the 30s at this point. Okay, so let me just end. So I'm not able to move this up.
Down at the trackpad.
Where?
Down here.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. That's not working either. Okay, I want to just talk a little bit about the students at City. It's not working.
Try this pad, maybe.
I hate Macs. Okay, so in 1969, the City University was completely white. But the students at City College, which is in Harlem, and some of them were black students, shut down the City University and basically said, if we don't go to school, nobody goes to school. Once they shut down the school, they had open admissions. They had remediation classes. People were going, happily through school. No tuition, 1976. This was a strategy on the part of the city, councilmen, senators, people who wanted to get rid of the blacks at City University. They impose tuition, they give some compensation, some TAP, some financial aid, but basically their intention was to get rid of these students. And so over time, it went from $200 a semester to now $3,000 a semester, and this is at the community colleges. And so, the attitude basically is to drive people out. So our students are, and I can't move this again. How do you move this thing? Can you move it?
Maybe. That's amazing.
No, you got the trackpad. You got to use the trackpad.
This one.
Okay, yeah.
Two.
I'm a mouse person. Okay,
Okay.
there, aha.
But we split it in two now.
Okay, well, we don't want that.
No.
But all we got to do is, yes.
Okay, and
now, what we need is to have that track thing that we had for a
The
second.
track thing is here on the bottom.
Well, there was a bar here
I don't-
briefly on the right, which would have allowed us to.
No. Do you want to go?
No, let her do it. She knows how.
Do you want to go?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, there we go.
Two finger.
But that's what I was going two fingers up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm a fast one.
Mouse going.
Okay. Okay, so CUNY is now 77% students of color, 40% immigrants, 60% of the students make less than $30,000 a year. The Excelsior program that has been put into place by Cuomo and endorsed by Bernie Sanders, by the way, he was there during the signing, is a free education, but you have to take 15 credits. And most of my students, I have to tell you, work 2 and 3 jobs. They have kids. They have tremendous issues, as probably everybody here knows. The only people who are going to be able to benefit from the Excelsior program, you can make up to $150,000 a year, will be middle-class people. And so more and more, the black students and Latin students are now paying for the white students to go to school. I mentioned the 3-year contract. Okay, so one other thing. The state university, which has a different union, has just settled for a contract, and their salary as of fall 2012 will be $3,700 a semester. Very often, CUNY follows SUNY. And so this is by fall, 2022, this is what these people are going to be making. So my estimation for CUNY is that we're not going to be getting a whole lot better than, even though the cost of living is higher, but essentially the Barbara Bowen and the City University follows the State University. So I don't have any expectations that things are going to get any better. As a matter of fact, let me just, we had a demonstration in front of the Board of Trustees. And just so you know that the Board of Trustees at the City University, and I'm sure that's the case for San Francisco as well, Bill Thompson is the CAO of Siebert Cenero Shank. Ken Sunshine is the CEO of Sunshine Sachs. Sandra Wilkin is the CEO, I mean, we have all these people who are the Board of Trustees. I'll be done in a second. Are the Board of Trustees are all people who are CEOs of corporations. So you know that they don't have any particular interest in supporting or protecting the students at the City University. We had a demonstration in front of the Board of Trustees. We were, arguing for 7K or strike, which is now what we're saying. We're going to be going to all the different chapters and arguing for striking and shutting the City University down. But when we went to the Board of Trustees and started chanting, the bureaucrats basically tried to stop people from doing so. So my final thing is, obviously we need, in my opinion, a mass movement to make any sort of significant change, because as of the 60s and the 30s, the only thing that made any difference, the only reason why we have black students at the City University is because they shut the City University down. They didn't really wait to go to the legislature to see whether, that would be okay. So we have to build a national movement. I mean, this is happening also internationally. In London, there was a major demonstration on the part of part-timers also, who are pretty much in the same position as we are. Last year, Steve and I and a bunch of other people went to Chicago and organized a group called the Worker Solidarity Action Network. And what it basically is a united front. Whenever some workers are either out on a picket line, organizing a strike, organizing a boycott, we talk about how we can go and participate in extending. We're involved in the Driscoll boycott, whatever. There's a guy who's involved in it who used to work for Ford, who's now participating in a struggle in Colombia, South America, among Ford workers. So, I mean, right now, I think that's what we need to do, begin to build this kind of mass movement. It's not really a mass movement yet, but build an organization where people can participate together in protecting, defending, supporting, letting other people know around the country that this is what's happening, and publicize it so that we're not isolated city by city, state by state, but that we grow a movement that's going to move the old bureaucrats out and really organize organizations that will protect workers and really begin to fight for the real needs of the workers.
Talk about what's to be done, and that's what I want to talk about. Now, there's a natural temptation to just fight for a larger share of the pie for part-timers, but in the context of a shrinking pie, dwindling funding for public education, that would have to come out of the hides of somebody else, whether it be other sectors of the workforce or the students, whether in the form of higher tuitions or less money for their needs. That's not the way to go, especially since we have an alternate model that everyone is aware of as being imitated in numerous other states, the West Virginia model, where the West Virginia teachers put forward demands that everybody else supported, including the other unions, the parents, the students, and even some school principals, as I understand it. The recent rise in teacher strikes and militancy, which part-timers who want to do something about our situation need to piggyback onto, realistically, is in some ways a response to Janus, which was aimed squarely at destroying public sector unions. And by the way, I'll just say one thing about Janus. It's essentially, there's something called right to work, which exists in something like about half of American states, which is basically the state version of Janus, when you get right down to it. In right to work states, in general, if you're in the public sector, your wages will be about half if you're in union. Wisconsin, which went right to work, the unions shrunk dramatically because of the equivalent of Janus, and the wages of the workers also shrunk dramatically in a short period of time. That's the reality. If the unions go away, we're all screwed, bad as they are. Now, not least teachers' unions, whether public school or college teachers. It is the labor misleaders. We've had some nice description of the misdeeds of the misleaders from Carol. In all unions, certainly including faculty unions, who have paved the way for this Janus assault. Abandoning the militant methods that built the unions in the 1930s in the first place, putting the unions on the map in America. The labor bureaucracy, and that's what they are, they're bureaucrats essentially, has simply lain down in the face of the relentless attacks on unions, or resulting to, in my opinion, usually futile reliance on court suits and lobbying the Democratic Party, on which huge amounts of dues money have been spent, which could have been used to organize the unorganized. If all of the COPE money, which went into the pockets of the Democratic Party, were instead to go into strike funds and organizing the unorganized, America would be a different and better place. You have some pretty grotesque examples of the lie down and die policies of the faculty unions in New York, which Carol has described nicely. And as Margaret gave us the dollars and cents analysis, although I have some questions about her mathematics, we could talk about that later. But in any case, what's clear is that unions have always defended their traditional base, the full-timers, and rhetoric to the contrary tend to throw us part-timers under the bus. However, now, because of the part-timization of faculty, the part-timers are the majority membership of the faculty unions. Okay? That's a fact. That is something that's going to cause the union leadership's increasing trouble as time goes by, especially because of Janus. Because at this point, even the union leaders have got to recognize sooner or later that if they don't do something for the part-timers are not going to join the unions. And, you know, so this I can see some small examples of that in my own Peralta Federation of Teachers, but I might say a word or two about that. I'll just add one thing. Why is it that adjuncts in New York City, which is about the only state which you could argue is bluer than California, why is it that adjuncts get paid something like between half and 2/3 of what we get paid in California? It's because of the Taylor Law. Because if unions can't go on strike, all they can do is beg. So the unions in California spend all their efforts begging, and basically, certainly the adjuncts, and tend to get stomped. And why do the unions accept that? It's because the unions support the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party in New York has supported the Taylor Law for many years. There have been attempts by unions to defy the Taylor Law, most recently by the subway workers about 7 or 8 years ago, and they got hit with so many fines that the subway union, which has a long tradition. You know, the old President Mike Quill, the first time they tried to do the Taylor Law on the subway workers, Mike Quill got up and said the judge can drop dead in his black robes, and the union won a strike. And not long after that, Mike Quill dropped dead himself. But anyway. But in any case, and why is the Democratic Party down with things like the Taylor Law? It's because it's one of the two political parties of the ruling classes in this country, which got its start as a party of the slave owners, and in some ways hasn't really changed that much, despite some black faces in some very high places, notably Obama. In West Virginia, by the way, one more thing about the Taylor Law. In West Virginia, strikes by public workers are every bit as illegal as they are in New York State. The teachers simply did not care, and they won. Why could they win? It's because the strike had too much public support for the anti-strike laws of Virginia to be enforced. It's really that simple. So to win, we need a program going beyond our own immediate needs as part-timers that addresses the needs of everyone and needs of all Americans in the country going down the tubes, which is essentially what it is. Immediately, now I'm going to drop back and talk about the program that we need as part-timers. Firstly, I think the division between part-timers and full-timers needs to be broken down, especially in the community colleges, because we do the same work, but why is it that they have so many more privileges than we do? There's two demands that I have raised. Hey, I even ran this by the president of my rotten union, DVC, who said, gee, this sounds like a fine idea. Gee, I just wish we could have the power to negotiate that. Number one, here in California, by state law, community college teachers, I'm talking primarily about the community colleges here, are required to teach 5 classes. Plus, they've got all the extra work, which frankly, all that extra administrative work involved is the equivalent of another class. And as far as I'm sure, should probably be paid as such. But in other words, they're teaching 6 classes, effectively. That'll run you ragged, especially in a community college where it's not like, if you're at UC Berkeley, you have TAs to do the work for you. You have to do all the grading and so forth yourself. It's enough to drive you insane, frankly. So they get paid well, but they're grossly overworked. So that needs to be reduced from 5 classes to a saner 4 classes, with, of course, no loss in pay. That's number one, and which would, of course, open up more jobs for part-timers, especially if that 80% cap, if that 67% cap is increased, which is something I haven't thought about very much, but I have no problem with that. Secondly, and this is the weird thing, if you teach at a community college, who's the right person to hire as a full-time professor? Someone who's been there for 5 or 6 years previously teaching that very same class and has the experience. There ought to be a rule whereby when full-timers are hired, that unless there's not a part-timer who has done the class before, that you should hire one of the part-timers for it. That should be right there in the union contract. Now, I made the interesting discovery, I think Carol told me they actually had something vaguely like that in New York, right? And in fact, in the Peralta system, when I moved to the Peralta system, I discovered that at least they had a mini version of that. You'd have interviewing. Okay. Right. Right. We don't have a screen, do we?
No, but it's making noise in there.
Okay, right. Okay, so we have actually a mini version of that, the Peralta. I won't go over the details. But the problem with that is, okay, you do all those things, it costs more money, right? Money is the key to everything here. So the union's attitude is, well, there's a pie, and we want our piece of the pie. And if you do something for the part-timers, that'll mean some of the pie taken away from the full-timers. And then if, so those 2 demands, I think, are just the beginning of wisdom. Okay. Then, of course, there's the question of all the other unions. Like Carol mentioned, what we need is one union from everyone from the janitors and maybe the construction workers all the way up through the full-time faculty. I think Steve told me the other day that there's some university in Canada where they have something like that already, right? Yeah. So it's certainly something that can be done. And that would mean, look, I have 20 years of experience before becoming a college in the newspaper industry as a union activist. And that was always a big issue. When one union go on strike, the other unions go scab on them. I was a TA at UC Berkeley for a number of years. Very militant TA's union, which, by the way, is so militant that the last time I checked, which was, I admit, about 10 or 12 years ago, their wages are actually higher than that of UC lecturers, if you include benefits. Okay, and they went on strike twice while I was there. And in fact, the president of the local, I was in a labor history class together with him, and I was sort of mentoring him a little bit. And I said, look, you've got to have what's called a picket line clause in the contract, whereby if one union goes on strike, you've got the right not to cross their picket lines. And
are we open?